Good afternoon to our audience of YouTube and Facebook. Today we are going to have this webinar that will be devoted to a very important topic, which is the nexus of COVID-19 and terrorism. I know that so many studies and research have been done on this aspect, including by the Counterterrorism Committee of the United Nations Security Council and other think tanks. This is a very predominant topic, especially that we have just celebrated the 20th anniversary of September 11, and that in the very center of the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan was the issue of countering terrorism in this part of the world. So it is very relevant and timely that the Policy Center of the New South, in conjunction and in partnership with EuroMeD, would address this issue and to make a knowledgeable introduction to this very important item. I would like to call upon Youssef Tobi, who conducted a study on thriving on uncertainty, COVID-19 related opportunities for terrorist groups. But before giving him the floor, I would like to ask and to call upon Ms. Zin Ftay just to say a few words about the very rich partnership that we have between the Policy Center of the New South and EuroMeD. And immediately after her introduction and the introduction by Youssef Tobi, we have a bench of very eminent researchers and senior fellows who will bring their knowledge, their expertise, and their contribution to the discussion of this item. So, Zin Ftay, you have the floor to introduce the partnership between EuroMeD and the Policy Center of the New South. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Ambassador Levitsky. I am delighted to be speaking on behalf of the Policy Center for the New South Partnerships Department. So before we dive in, sure will be a captivating presentation. I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the Policy Center for the New South, strong and long-standing partnership with the European University of the Mediterranean, IEMed. So for several years now, we have had the pleasure to collaborate with this partner on numerous occasions on various topics of mutual interest, such as migration and mobility, the green transition, the new EU agenda for the Southern Mediterranean, the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the Mediterranean region, as well as the instrumentalization of the COVID-19 crisis by terrorist groups, which is today's topic of discussion. The PCNS has also had the honor of coordinating the 2020 edition of the MEDPING 5+5 network of think tanks of the Western Mediterranean, together with IEMed and the Union for the Mediterranean. This edition brought together leading experts from think tanks, academia, and diplomacy to discuss the prospects of economic recovery in a post-COVID-19 era in the region. Since its inception in May 2016, the MEDPING 5+5 network has organized 4 annual fora, providing a platform for experts from the whole region to analyze the factors underpinning security and stability, as well as economic, human, and sustainable development in the Western Mediterranean. As highlighted by these collaborations, the Mediterranean region is of utmost importance for both the PCNS and IEMed, and continuously fuels the solid partnership between the two institutions. The Policy Center is also proud to be an active member of the EuroMeSCo network, an important network of research centers and think tanks based in the Euro-Mediterranean area. In fact, the PCNS had the pleasure to co-organize and co-host the 2018 edition of the EuroMeSCo annual conference. Additionally, one of our young researchers has recently been invited by IEMed to join EuroMeSCo's Young Researchers Lab as a board member for the period from 2021 to 2022. Finally, as the PCNS has recently launched its pluriannual research program featuring themes of great interest for both institutions, we are confident that the collaboration between the PCNS and IEMed will continue to grow stronger not only bilaterally, but also in the framework of the EuroMeSCo network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zina, for a very concise presentation of the partnership PCNS EuroMeD. And now we move to the centerpiece of this event, Youssef. Tobi, you have the floor to present your findings on thriving on uncertainty, COVID-19 related opportunity for terrorist groups. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Mr. Lulishki. Thank you, Zineb, for this introduction. To add some more context, this study falls into the EuroMeSCo initiative Connecting the Dots. That is a project co-funded by the European Union and EuroMeD. This project, it aims at contributing at inclusive and evidence-based policy making by fostering research from both sides of the Mediterranean. So without further ado, I want to talk about the study, Thriving on Uncertainty, COVID-19 related opportunities for terrorist groups. This is a joint study coordinated by the Policy Center for the New South. Mr. Abdelhak Bassou and myself worked with 5 researchers from different background and expertise to establish a potential link between COVID-19 and terrorist activities across the Mediterranean basin. The researchers being from different countries, namely Egypt, Belgium, Germany, and Morocco, the first step of our study was to reconcile and coordinate the different points of views to give a general direction to the study. After various meetings and discussions, a consensus was found to explore the link between COVID-19 and terrorist groups with both a geographic and a thematic scope. In line with this direction, researchers explored this link in the Sahel, the Maghreb and the Mashriq, offering different perspectives and scientific knowledge to this very new topic of COVID-19 repercussions on the terrorist landscape. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a cataclysmic impact on all aspects of the functioning of our world. The relevance of the possibility of the spread of a global virus with the spread of terrorism is not immediately obvious, as it is difficult for a direct causal link to be scientifically established. However, taking into account a consideration of how state responses and pre-existing socioeconomic grievances can be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, can lead to innovative findings on how terrorist groups have adapted and conducted their activities during the pandemic. Analyzing how the response of states impacts socioeconomic grievances and how it interacts with terrorist activities, the authors have found that the pandemic has impacted the operational and ideological framework of terrorist groups in multiple ways. Starting with ideology, Mr. Bassou's chapter explains how the pandemic was presented as an act of God, punishing the ungodly and weakening enemy governments. In terms of propaganda, this virus was presented as a soldier of Allah and was used for online recruitment strategies. I think Mr. Bassou, who's present with us today, will have the opportunity to further expand on this. Concerning the operational front, poor state responses to the pandemic may have reinforced the legitimacy of terrorist groups among populations, as they were continuously used as arguments advancing the agenda of these groups in the areas of intervention. To illustrate this, let me focus on the Sahel and how this argument was played out on the field. In his chapter, Mr. Klaas explains how the inability of Sahelian governments to provide basic services such as healthcare and security would likely deepen as resources were shifting towards fighting COVID-19 instead of providing basic healthcare services which were already under strain in pre-pandemic era. Furthermore, segments of the population were said to be at risk of being further disenfranchised in the event of state COVID-19 lockdown measures that lack respect of fundamental rights, as Sahelian states rolled out containment measures that in some cases seemed to point to a crackdown on civil liberties. Nonetheless, the emerging picture is rather that the early rhetoric of VEO, violent extremist operations, leadership has not brought about significant changes on the ground in terms of COVID-19, induced shifts in operational realities or VEO's recruitment strategies. Indeed, using data spreading from 2016 to 2021, the authors have shown that COVID-19 has not had a structural effects on levels of political violence in the Sahel. This argument is also reinforced by the fact that despite early fears about its potential to wreak havoc on the African continent, the COVID-19 pandemic spread at a relatively slow pace throughout West Africa and the Sahel, especially when compared to its spread in the global north. Indeed, if we look at the recruitment strategies of violent extremist groups in the Sahel, pre-existing factors and notions prevailed in the analysis. For example, in Mali, Katiba Masina's success at the local level has been partly helped by young herders' rejections of local elites and by subverting local power structures. Similarly, the presence of local youth who felt excluded because of their lower social status facilitated their recruitment by extremist groups. This suggests that the recruitment rhetoric put forward by VEOs, violent extremist operations, tapped into the feeling of rejection and inequality that was pre-existing. Moving along to the Mashreq, the author Ms. Iman Ragab, analyzes how ISIS' ideological standpoint and current operational framework had been impacted by COVID-19. One interesting argument that was brought up was how the increase of internet usage, also caused by the lockdown measures who were caused by the pandemic in itself, and its potential for becoming a catalyzer for ISIS second-line terrorists or media jihadists. This notion of media jihadists was very important in Ms. Ragab's chapter, and it said that they operate solely on the virtual platform, pushing narratives and helping recruitment for violent extremist groups. The author also expanded on this media jihad and put an emphasis on how this type of jihad supports ISIS practices. Indeed, the media jihad supports ISIS by using media tools and technologies to spread ISIS-related content. ISIS explains that this type of jihad should be practiced with vigilance so as not to be caught by its enemies, and it urges media jihadists to follow the needed security procedures published by pro-ISIS cybersecurity group AFAQ, which proves a sophistication and the importance that is developed to this media jihadists by ISIS. I want to conclude this short and non-exhaustive presentation of this study with the Maghreb, our region. Clara Auguste Saab chapter looks at the Maghreb overall trends when it comes to violent extremism. The author points out that jihadist groups in the Maghreb have become weaker and weaker in recent years, now being at a low point, a historic low point. But the author said that the underlying grievances fueling youth and recruitment already are remaining. Ms. So points out that the socioeconomic grievances in which terrorist groups thrive and feed off remain generally unaddressed, raising a concern of a rise of violence in the region. As for COVID-19 in relation to terrorist activities, when looking at the mere numbers displaying the dynamics and violent incident in the Maghreb state, the assumption about COVID-19 fueling terrorism and violent extremism does not seem to have come true, at least for the time being. So exploring both the Sahel, the Mashreq, and the Maghreb, all the authors have found that the causal link between COVID-19 and a spread or an augmentation of terrorist activities is hard to scientifically establish. And they also point out furthermore and put even more importance on the fact that this link is almost non-existent, especially when we analyze the Sahel. The link between COVID-19 the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and an augmentation of terrorist activities is not obvious. So the main scientific conclusion of this study that we've conducted and coordinated would be this. The link between COVID-19 and terrorist activities isn't obvious and isn't yet to be scientifically established, and already pre-existing grievances among populations are the main factors fueling extremist groups, both in terms of ideological and operational standpoint. To conclude, I wanna give you the main recommendations of the study that you can consult. I would like to say that the study is published, and everyone in the audience can consult it and read it for a more exhaustive analysis of this link and how we came up with this overall conclusion. But before that, I would like to give you the main recommendations of the study. First, attention should be paid to redirecting existing funding towards COVID-19 responses. Shrinking aid budgets in the medium term can have negative effect further down the line, especially when it concerns programming geared towards service provision in fragile areas. So both in terms of Mashreq and in the Sahel, the authors have pointed out the fact that some of the funding for COVID-19 could have been redirected to the existing funds for service provision in fragile areas. And they say that attention should be paid about this fact. Do not derive all the funds towards COVID-19 as it is conjunctural, and focus on the systemic factors that drive violent extremism. Secondly, we urge European countries to launch on the national level a large-scale awareness campaign that explains how to report suspicious online recruitment related to the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. Or so-called ISIS, and other terrorist groups, of course, and the type of help and protection offered in return. For such campaigns to be effective, they should be carried out in cooperation with all stakeholders, including local mosques, imams, Islamic centers, schools, universities, and hackers communities. In Mrs. Ragab chapter, we talk about the media jihadist and its spread, and the author thinks that it's something to be addressed, and European countries should direct funding to online campaigns to provide counter narratives and actually tackle this issue of media jihad. Also, there's a need to establish an effective cooperation strategy for the exchange of information and expertise between the countries of the region, but also within the EU at the international level. This is something that all researchers that focus on terrorist activities keep on saying. The exchange of information is crucial to tackling the root causes of terrorism, and also to stop any type of violent extremist operation. Also, the authors encouraged an evidence-based approach when it comes to the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic as a crisis intensifier. As the COVID-19 provokes a bit of panic, we as researchers, we urge to have an evidence-based approach and look at it and look at COVID-19 link to terrorist activities or any other topic with calm and with rationality. Lastly, two last recommendations. PVE and CVE efforts need to be understood not only as a mere security task, but also require broader efforts and joint solutions with regard to legal migration and sustainable economic growth. I think this is very important. The nexus between security and development is something that countries from the South advocate for, and it's something to be really implemented within PVE and CVE efforts. Lastly, we asked to dedicate financial support to encourage Iraqi and Syrian Sunni youth to launch small and micro enterprises, especially in areas destroyed during the war against ISIS. So this falls within the fact that PVE and CVE efforts should integrate a nexus between security and development, and that all efforts to fight terrorist activities have to be also directed at bettering and enhancing the socioeconomic conditions in the areas that are victim of these activities. So to give you a big synthesis before giving the floor to Mrs. Ludishki, this study says that there is clearly no causal link between COVID-19 and a spread of terrorist activities, but it encourages the European Union and the international community to keep on its efforts to fight terrorism by giving off more resources to socioeconomic betterment in the areas that are victim of terrorist activities, and to keep on collaborating with the South to foster an inclusive dialogue on this topic and other various topics that are common to our area. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Mr. Ludishki so we can open the debate and questions to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm taking back the floor. And since you have referred to the very valuable contribution that Sir Abdelhak Bassou made to this comprehensive study, I would like to invite him to make his contribution to this debate before going into maybe clarifying some recommendations and make some comments on the content of this very important study. So Bassou, you have the floor. Bassou is our leading expert on combating terrorism. I'm not saying terrorism, but combating terrorism and the link between security and development. You have the floor, Bassou.
Yeah, in terrorism too, if you want. Thank you, Si Mohammed. I will just try to present my chapter, some resume of my chapter. I will just talk about what the pandemic has brought in benefits for terrorist groups in terms of doctrine. I think at the start of the pandemic, extremists believed that the pandemic affected only non-Muslims. It was Chinese, it was Americans, Europeans. But when the pandemic affected Muslims, and then they propagated the idea that it was a divine punishment. But when the Muslims were affected by the COVID-19, they created another discourse. They say that it is a punishment for the ungodly kuffar, but also a test by which God tests the patience and the faith of the Muslims. Also, in terms of doctrine, another argument was developed. It was developed and addressed to the poor population living in precariousness or precarity. This argument consisted in telling people that government only take care of the elites and only care of the rich. This discourse made it possible for them to recruit new militants, and in one hand, and in the other hand, to stigmatize and alter the image of government. I think I will stop here, and we will talk about this if there's some questions, because the study have treated some other topics. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Bassou. Thank you for shedding light on this very, very important dimension, how the narrative of the terrorist group has been adjusted depending on the stages of the development of COVID-19. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Miss Nihal Mqirmi. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Ludishki. Congratulations, Youssef, Tobi, for coordinating this amazing project, and Mr. Bassou as well. So as it was explained by Mr. Tobi at the beginning, and also brilliantly argued throughout the entire report, there is no scientific evidence that there is a clear correlation between COVID-19 and the increase of terrorist activities. But it is also important to acknowledge that although there is no such clear evidence, there has been some elements that helped terrorist groups to either change or adapt their narratives. And I believe it is important to keep this in mind, as it could potentially have effects not in the short term, but probably in the medium term. It is clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has put an additional strain on already very fragile public health systems in the several regions analyzed in the report. But it also, as Youssef said also in his presentation, in his introduction, that it also made states to divert away ongoing international development projects, resources to respond to the outbreak of the pandemic, which could have and will probably have operational implications on the development of other socioeconomic and security programs. Although the pandemic has had profound economic consequences worldwide, in the countries analyzed in the report, these socioeconomic grievances have either added to intercommunal or interethnic cleavages that in turn exacerbated levels of violence. So in this fragile and very sensitive countries, terrorist groups have used the reduction or even complete absence of significant immediate financial helps to present themselves as the potential alternative that could provide populations with what they need. So this element is really important to keep in mind, as it was, as I said, brilliantly explained throughout the entire report, because it's the importance of this narrative of the terrorist groups using always these dichotomies to present themselves as an option, as the alternative to what they would call the corrupt state, a very unstable one that could provide their populations with what they need. And apart from religious arguments to justify their actions, they can use words such as regaining respect, which is really important, giving back to the community, or even equitable justice. And it really is appealing to see the strength of this narrative, the strength of the words carefully used in very specific contexts and in front of a very specific population. And finally, I thought it was really relevant to also talk about the different methods these terrorist groups use to recruit new jihadists, as it also proves their capacity of adaptability, and how they continue to reinvent and their ways, their methods, in order to avoid detection. Thank you.
Thank you, Nihal. And now it's Mr. Usama's Tobi, researchers in the PCNS in international relations. It's your turn to maybe to share with us your assessment of the main recommendations of this important study. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Lulishki. I think the findings of the study in its 3 chapters are very interesting, as they are mostly, let's say, counterintuitive. The study shows, as you pointed, Nihal and Youssef, the clear gap between the experts' initial concerns and assumptions regarding COVID-19 as a crisis intensifier, and the fears they had about the instrumentalization of the pandemic by violent extremist groups for recruitment purposes, and the situation on the ground in all of the studied Sahel, Mashriq, and Maghreb region countries. Those assumptions largely based on the propaganda efforts deployed by the terrorist groups in the early days of the pandemic, and also the opportunistic nature of these groups did not take into consideration the local dynamics in terms of recruitment drivers and the differentiated impact of the pandemic on each one of the studied countries. The lack of evidence pointing to a significant change in the nature of these activities of the terrorist groups, as both of my colleagues mentioned, due to COVID-19, applies to the three studied regions. So what is interesting, considering the opportunistic nature of these groups, is that the organizations didn't position themselves as alternative provider of services in the context of COVID-19. There is hardly any evidence that terrorist groups assisted local communities with regards to COVID-19 health and socioeconomic impacts. And this could be explained by the fact that the rural areas where violent extremist groups operate in the Sahel countries were not that much affected by the pandemic. And also by the fact that it is beyond some of the terrorist groups' current capabilities in both the Mashriq and the Maghreb. So one identifying example that are found in the study of that is that ISIS militants in Iraq and Syria did of sorts conform to measures adopted by the governments during the lockdown period, and did not call for disobedience against decisions such as the closure of mosques and the ban on prayers. So arguments are made also in this order of ideas, is that arguments are made in one of the chapters that early propaganda should be interpreted, and this is some sort of explanation to the attitude of the groups, that propaganda should be interpreted as a sign of ideological explanation of the pandemic, rather than attempts to recruit. So these arguments are really very important to keep in mind, as they offer us an explanation on why COVID-19 didn't impact these groups' operation in these countries. Finally, I think the most interesting finding for me was that the authors didn't exclude that what is true now may not be true in the near future. So there could be in the near future some sort of instrumentalization of COVID-19 related grievances by VEOs, and it is, I think, an invitation for us researchers to continue monitoring the situation and study relevant data to see how things will evolve in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Tobi. Now it's Si Nu'man Sharqawi to maybe select some of these findings and recommendations, and maybe pinpoint some problematic issues related to this important study. You have the floor, Si Nu'man.
Thank you. I think it was a brilliant paper about because it's a very pressing issue, COVID-19 right now, and how it's affected violent extremist organizations. So some of the questions I had after reading the paper, I think, to what extent should the focus be shifted from from direct causes of the COVID-19 pandemic to the indirect? Because as the paper concludes, there's a lack of scientific basis to find a causal indicator that there's a link between COVID and violent extremist organizations, but maybe there's a link with indirect causes, and I would be very interested to see how one would explore that. I think one other important has been raised, which is regarding the set of assumptions that informed the initial discourse. Like Osama said, there were a lot of assumptions in the beginning about this issue that have changed over time. And the paper mentions how some of these assumptions were based on the experiences of the global north rather than the global south. So how can this be avoided moving forward? I know we at the Policy Center, we firmly believe in shifting that paradigm. It was also mentioned that COVID-19 related propaganda potentially leading up to increased popularity of an extremist organization is the most direct effect of COVID-19. So our public campaigns to address this issue, that was one of the recommendations. Further regulation of the internet, perhaps through cooperation agreements between different countries. Another conclusion in the paper was how COVID-19 is an intensifier of drivers rather than a driver in itself. So as a result, the scope again becomes the root causes versus symptoms issue. So how can the root causes be addressed? I think there's a lot of points to be made there. The COVID-19, the paper also mentions astutely that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to serious reductions of GDP of Western countries, which will lead to shrinking budgets because a lot of countries have their GDP allocation based on as a percentage of GDP. So how can the negative ramifications of a drop in budget be avoided, or is it inevitable? So I think some of these questions are extremely relevant right now, given the the continued presence of terrorist groups in different regions like the Sahel, like the Maghreb, like Iraq and Syria. So ultimately, I think, given the totality of indicators, I'd be very interested to see what the participants think. To what extent has COVID-19 affected violent extremist organizations? And how can we better prevent counterterrorism and radicalization in this uncertain digitalized age? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nu'man Sharqawi. And so far, I think we have, we did not neglect, we did not minimize, but I think there is a dimension that also needs to be addressed, and there is no better expectancy, Mustafa Rizrazi, to address the psychological, the societal, and the sociological aspect of this important topic. Of course, based on what came out from this study. I know that this dimension is very extensive. It will take us maybe hours to even introduce the what is at stake. But you are invited to make few comments on this study.
Thank you, Excellency. First of all, let me congratulate the team. Bassou, who was leading, and Tobi, who was coordinating, and other members. The congratulation also is extended to this cooperation between Policy Center and the network. Well, I will be brief. Just maybe it seems to be quite interesting to say that if we remember few months ago when we were under the lockdown situation, we have the feeling that we were somehow terrorized because we were restricted to be in our usual daily life, and we were confused because there were so many uncertainties around COVID-19. So just this evidence is quite similar to the terrorist phenomena, because at the end of the day, the terrorist phenomena, the threat, is related to change our behavior, our daily life mode. The second phenomena, and it was extensively mentioned by Abdelhak Bassou when he take in charge in this study, the strategic perception of jihadist groups, not the tactical, not the operability. So in terms of literature and ideology, the connection is there. In terms of the interpretation of this epidemic as, soldier of God, as punishment for non-believers, or as testing, imtihan, for believers, but also if we take, for instance, ISIS in its newspaper, Naba, we can see that there was a development in March, April. They were talking about the enemy of God against, non-believers. In May, they have published good conduct to avoid the contamination. Then after July to December, they have been talking about how to monitor this epidemic to take advantage in the field against the enemy. So this evolution is quite interesting. Maybe this study is very important. So some colleagues were talking about maybe this connection, the impact can be projected in the future. Maybe yes, because if we are talking from psychological point of view, the post-traumatic syndrome manifests after 6 months, sometimes after 18 months even. So it is not something that will come suddenly or quickly. Maybe I will just, I'm not sure, but the feeling I did have, as was said by other colleagues, that the diversity of approaches adopted by the team is something excellent. For me, for instance, maybe the part related to the Maghreb came with some conclusion that there is no evidence of such connection or such, there is no increase of terrorist threat during the pandemic. It depends on the indicator used by the researcher. If, the researcher is using the number of terrorist attacks, yes, the conclusion is right. But if we take the indicator of the number of terrorist threats, we can see that, for instance, in Morocco, we can see that the number of persons arrested in terrorist-related cases, mainly in the recruitment online, has increased from 83 in 2016 to 192 in 2019 to 408 in 2020. So at least this migration to online activities and the increase of the terrorist threat, can be, for me at least, quite clear. But definitely, I guess that this project is huge and a very important add value to, experts and researchers to project more reflection in the coming years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mustafa. I think we give the opportunity to all our panelists to make their contribution. I still have two elements on my agenda. First, I will see if we have received some questions addressed to the panel, and after answering these questions, I will try to make a very brief wrap up of our session. I do apologize to all those very eminent experts who contributed to this webinar. I know that I frustrated most of you by not giving you enough time to say exactly what you wanted to say, but bear with me and do not take it against me, or we have some time to discuss about that in other opportunities. So let me see what are the questions that have been addressed by our audience. Just time for me to get into, okay. One, two, I have three questions. First one, to what extent COVID-19 impacted the narratives of terrorist groups, especially ISIS? Is the shift you all have described really significant? So that's the first question. Second question, there was plenty of political turmoil across the Sahelian region. Do you think the pandemic accelerated the upheavals in Mali and Guinea. And the last question, one of the experts referred to the root causes, the underlying causes of terrorism. Do you think that in the circumstances of crisis that we are experiencing, is the state has the time, the energy, and the resources to address the root causes, or is it in the obligation to take care of the short-term effect of COVID-19 and of terrorism? So these are the three questions, and it's up to all of you to address one or two or three questions. Who goes first? Who is volunteering to answer? I see that everybody is rushing, so I'm going to ask Sibasso to give a preliminary answer. Okay, Sibasso, we have to wait for him. Sibasso, we will wait for you. Nihal, do you have some element of response to one of these questions?
Yes, so I'll take the first one about the recruitment in ISIS. So the second chapter of the report explains that since the eruption of the pandemic, ISIS has had to develop a kind of complex approach to communicate with its members, but also and especially to attract new followers. So it has maintained its very extremist religious discourse. And it kept, as Mr. Bassou said in the beginning, and also brilliantly explains in his chapter, that they kept saying how this is a punishment of God, and that ISIS followers should obey God's command in order to avoid getting infected, or to not transfer the virus, as it's one of the ISIS is one of the terrorist groups that has not it has acknowledged the existence of the pandemic, but it has also tried to make its followers gave ways for its followers to avoid getting infected. So it's another element that ISIS has used was to say in order to attract new members, it has recycled its encouragement for new jihadists to practice a new or a renewed way of jihad, and it has done so either from within the camps that are in Syria and Iraq with families of former terrorists. It has also used new information channels in the dark web, yeah, it was mainly also in the refugee camps, and that will be it for me.
Thank you. Who goes second between Tobi and Sharqawi?
I can take the second question regarding the Sahelian countries of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The first chapter argues that the pandemic did not fundamentally change the nature of the terrorist organizations' involvement in these countries. So there continues to be an upwards trend in those countries in terms of terrorism, but the argument is that it's not related to the pandemic, but to other drivers related to the situation there. So the argument is that there was a lot of attacks, a lot of terrorist activities there, but they weren't related to the pandemic, except for the early days of COVID, where there was some sort of propaganda, which some explain as which is according to some of the authors an explanation rather than an invitation to join. So I don't think there is, according to the study and to arguments made, that there is an evolution with regards to that.
Thank you. Nu'man?
Yeah, thanks. I can take the third question about root causes. So one conclusion reached in the paper is that COVID-19 has had no impact on the intensity, distribution, and composition of political violence in the Sahel. So given that it's too early to tell about indirect effects, such as worsening socioeconomic conditions, further increasing recruitments, that means root causes are still the issue that needs to be addressed, particularly in the Sahel. And I think in this regard, one undertouched dynamic is proactivity, because many states and regional organizations, they see little or no point in addressing issues before they arise, with the old saying, why fix it, why it's not broken? Well, then it becomes too late. So what needs to happen is policymakers need to do a better job dealing with the drivers that bring about violent extremism. For example, the paper itself mentions how there was a report by the UNDP which surveyed individuals about their personal tipping points for joining a VEO, as 71% reported that it was government action. So as long as that continues to be the case, all these secondary factors won't be the thing that needs to be addressed first to actually find a long-term sustainable solution to these issues. The paper also mentions the repression mobilization nexus. So the more repression these people feel and the populace feels that it's under, it's said to have an escalating effect mobilization, because VOs they recruit through, like the paper says, range from socioeconomic arguments to tapping into intercommunal or inter-ethnic cleavages, filling in for state absence, protecting against violence from the state, as well as self-fulfillment, prestige, or religious arguments. So in that case, while COVID-19, there's no scientific basis for saying that it has had a direct effect on the increase of VOs, which is a very important conclusion that this paper has reached. Root causes will still remain the primary thing that should be tackled, not the symptoms. And I think that would go a long way to hopefully finding peace, stability, and development in the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you, Si Sharqawi. I still have, I would like to call upon Si Al-Zaghazi and Si Bassou, but before doing that, let me say that I think the two first questions have been extensively addressed. We are left with one, which is the third one, plus an additional one that I have just received. So I'm going to ask Si Bassou and Si Al-Zaghazi to first address the issue of the root causes. Est-ce que l'État est en mesure d'adresser les causes profondes du terrorisme au moment où il doit gérer uniquement la crise? Première question. Deuxième question que je viens de recevoir, est-ce que vous pensez que la vulnérabilité croissante des populations à cause de Covid-19 aura pour conséquence d'augmenter la capacité de recrutement des groupes terroristes? Je l'ai lu en français parce que je l'ai reçu en français. OK. Si Bassou or Si Mustafa, it's up to you to begin and to conclude your responses, please. Si Bassou. Si vous pouvez activer l'audio parce que...
Voilà.
Très bien, parfait. Allez-y.
Je faisais avant de parler. Alors, j'ai deux ou trois remarques. La première, c'est que on a parlé de l'avenir, de est-ce que cela peut se tenir à l'avenir. Je crois que déjà à l'avenir, au niveau de la propagande, beaucoup d'États se sont révélés faibles en termes d'infrastructures médicales. Et je crois que c'est un argument qui dorénavant sera utilisé dans la propagande d'une manière très intense. Deuxième remarque, c'est que j'imagine qu'au niveau des opérations terroristes, au niveau opérationnel, les infrastructures d'industrie pharmaceutique vont devenir des cibles. Et les stocks de vaccins aussi. Parce que si dans les États, je parle du Sahel par exemple, du bassin du lac Tchad ou Mozambique, l'État peut vacciner les citoyens, mais les combattants terroristes ne sont pas vaccinés. Donc, où iront-ils chercher leur vaccin? Et je crois que là aussi, c'est quelque chose à laquelle il faut prêter attention. Donc, sur cette surveillance des stocks et cette surveillance de toutes les infrastructures de l'industrie pharmaceutique. On a parlé tout à l'heure de la question du Sahel, du bassin du lac Tchad, et que la pandémie n'a pas agi sur le terrorisme, mais il a peut-être agi sur les forces qui luttent contre le terrorisme. Le grand exemple nous vient pas dans un pays, dans une région, des forces de renseignement qui devaient aller dans les villages, rencontrer les populations, se mettre avec les gens pour recueillir de l'information dans un cadre d'intelligence et de renseignement. Et bien qu'il y avait peur qu'ils ne partaient pas. Il y avait un manque dans ce domaine. Maintenant, pour la question des États, est-ce que les États peuvent à la fois agir contre le terrorisme, agir contre la pandémie? Donc, cela dépend des moyens de cet État. Et là, je pense par exemple maintenant à l'Afghanistan. Quand les gens qui veulent remettre sur le bon chemin le gouvernement taliban, l'assister ou l'aider, est-ce qu'ils vont maintenant l'aider à combattre les 2000 combattants de Daesh qu'il y a et qui risquent de remettre tout en question, ou est-ce qu'il est de notre devoir en tant que communauté internationale de sauver une population qui a toujours été marginalisée en termes de traitement contre la pandémie? Est-ce que les gens sont en train d'être vaccinés en Afghanistan? C'est tout un problème qui est causé actuellement. Quelle est la priorité? Quelle est la priorité chez les pays qui ne peuvent pas mener les deux combats? Là, c'est un problème. Maintenant, est-ce que l'augmentation de la population augmenterait le recrutement? J'hésite beaucoup à le dire, dans la mesure, si vous prenez l'Afrique, si on dit qu'il y a des recrutements au Nigeria parce qu'ils sont 160 millions, les Éthiopiens sont pourtant 110 millions, mais il n'y a pas de recrutement sur le terrorisme. Donc, le recrutement dépendrait, à mon avis, si on veut le mettre en relation avec la Covid, dépendrait beaucoup plus de la faillite de certains États à pouvoir s'occuper de leur population et de leur procurer ce qu'il faut. Merci.
C'est Mustafa.
Merci, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Moi, je m'aligne beaucoup à ce qui a été dit par Abdelhak. Tout d'abord, si on prend... Bon, je crois que voir les causes du terrorisme ou de la pandémie, je crois qu'il y a... C'est une question d'ailleurs qui relève à deux départements différents. La gestion des crises, c'est un département à part qui ne relève pas au montage des politiques publiques à long terme. Alors, on ne peut pas attendre jusqu'à ce qu'on va régler la question de gouvernance et ne pas lutter contre la menace ou contre la pandémie. Ça, c'est problématique. C'est vrai que les causes sont importantes dans le long terme, mais je pense que quand il y a une menace, un département de renseignement ou de police ne va pas croiser les bras pour dire voilà, on doit attendre le montage d'une politique d'emploi et tout ça. Alors ça, et on peut justement généraliser ça sur les différentes scènes. Deuxième élément, je crois que cette question aussi bon, sur le futur, si on se projette sur le futur, il y a plusieurs éléments qui s'imposent. Le premier, c'est que la pandémie, elle a changé notre perception de demain, notre perception vis-à-vis la peur, notre perception vis-à-vis la mort même. Et cela, il renforce la vulnérabilité chez la population des jeunes qui n'ont pas de travail, qui sont marginalisés. Parce que justement, quand on traverse ce seuil de la peur à cause de la pandémie, alors plus que 18 mois, la population a cohabité avec l'extrême état d'angoisse. Il y a un fameux psychiatre coréen qui l'a appelé Corona Syndrome. Il l'a appelé aussi Corona Blue. C'est comme des nuages qui dominent la scène et qui vont accompagner, et justement cette perception vis-à-vis c'est que la mort et tout ça, ils sont instrumentalisés dans le narratif des groupes djihadistes. Deuxième élément, j'ai oublié de mentionner ça tout à l'heure, c'est que le comportement arrogant des pays industrialisés au début de la crise, le manque de solidarité, il a dévoilé justement, il a donné un point de plus aux groupes djihadistes de dire voilà cet Occident, comment il nous traite en cas de crise. Il était même au sein des pays occidentaux, cette question a été relevée, mais entre le Nord et le Sud, il a manifesté de manière plus forte, plus claire. Même chez nous, nous chercheurs, on a eu un moment de se poser la question comment ils gèrent, comment ils ont retiré tous ces slogans de solidarité dans un moment de panique. Et sûrement, tous ces éléments, si les États, dans leur politique de prévention, de lutte contre justement le narratif extrémiste, ça va sûrement être exploité par les groupes extrémistes en général. Merci.
Thank you, Mustafa. Well, I would like to, on behalf of the Policy Center of the New South and our audience, to thank all our panelists, Bassou, Zrazi, Youssef Tobi, Nihal Mkhermi, Oussama Tibi, Na'man Sharqawi, and Zin Fethi for putting together this event. I know that we did not exhaust all the ramifications and all the dimensions of this issue. And I must confess that it is extremely difficult for me to venture into wrapping up this session. I will make an attempt. I will begin first by saying that the findings that are reflected in this study stands only for the current situations, that things might change and we might be drawn into adjusting some element, if not finding a completely different conclusions. The study began, let's say, with two preliminary assumptions that come to mind whenever we think about this correlation between COVID and terrorism. The first assumption is that states are so busy in devoting all their energy and time and resources to combating the COVID-19, to providing a social safety net, that they don't have the attention, they don't have the time to take care of the other dimension, which is the threat of terrorism. Not 100%, but not to devote the same important resources, the same amount of time to this challenge. The second assumption is that because social media have been extensively used during the COVID-19, and that COVID-19 was an opportunity for these new technology of information and communication to really expand and impose themselves to the effect that the GAFA leaders managed to gain billions of dollars during this crisis. One could draw the assumption that this mobilization of new technology of information and the fact that people were in their homes devoting 19 hours after 24 hours to reading about everything could be an opportunity for terrorist groups to really disseminate and influence those who are could be potentially recruited. Well, the main finding to me was the fact that there is absolutely no scientific evidence or link or correlation that help to establish this correlation between the two. The second is that there is a call for resources to be devoted to developing efforts and narratives with the effect to countering the terrorism propaganda. 3, effort has to be undertaken in 3 directions. First, better understand, follow, and respond to the terrorist narrative. 2, devote resources to produce counter narrative and combat terrorism in the preventive dimension of the word. And 3, an appeal to all states to cooperate, to exchange with more transparency information about terrorism so that cooperation will become more efficient and it go beyond this selfish inclination of states to retain for themselves some key elements of information. To me, these are the 3 conclusions that I draw from this very important webinar. If some of my colleagues, the panelists, do not have something to add, I will first thank our audience for following us for the hour and 15 minutes of this very exciting webinar. I'm sure that we will come back to some aspects of this study and to this very important topic. In the meantime, I hope that everybody will keep safe and respect the basic rules of preserving our respective society from COVID-19 or any of the other variants. Thank you for your attention, and we will see you very shortly in the framework of the multiple activity of the Policy Center of the New South.
Thank you, Ambassador.